Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is one of our workshops as part of the season for exchange. I'm just going to let a few people in, but I will start off by, I suppose, doing some housekeeping for the session and introducing everything. So my name is Salome Wagaini. I am Programme Manager here at Season for Change, and this workshop will be recorded, so that's why all Mike's videos have been turned off. Please do use the chat function throughout. We want this to be a lovely and exchange-led session. But if you do have any technical difficulties, we have Days Hale on hand to help as our tech host. So if you want to direct your messages in the chat function to them, their name will come up as tech host Days Hale. So this session is being live captioned, courtesy of Jean Goff. So if you look to the bottom right of your screen on Zoom, you will see a subtitles button next to the share button, share screen function. So please use this to view the captions, and also there's an option to view the entire transcript in case you've missed anything. We'd love for you to join the conversation on social media. Our hashtag is #SeasonForChange. And this is, as I mentioned, the beginning of week 2 of Season for Exchange, which is a precursor to the open programme we'll be doing in spring. It's a 3-week programme, online workshops, conversations and artist interventions to inspire artists and arts professionals to learn, share knowledge and talk about climate action and climate justice. The project is led by Arts Admin and Julie's Bicycle, delivered in collaboration with partners nationwide and supported by Arts Council England and Paul Hamlin Foundation. And this workshop is being led by Will Price. So Will finished his MSc in Environment and Development at the University of Leeds, where he studied issues such as sustainable development, climate change mitigation and environmental policy. During his time in Leeds, he began volunteering for Friends of the Earth as part of their climate change and energy team, and worked on a variety of projects on topics including UK energy storage options and renewable energy development in Hull. Before his MSc, he studied history at the University of Sheffield and gained previous experience in communications roles. And Will is a member of the Julie's Bicycle team along with me. So I will leave it to you.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. Shall I just share my screen, Salome? Is that the easiest? Yeah. Oh, there we go. 2 seconds, everyone. Lovely. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thanks for that, Salome. My name's Will. My pronouns are he and him. As Salome mentioned, I've been at Julie's Bicycle for about 3 years now, and I mainly work in our consultancy team, our Creative Green team, who work one-to-one with organisations, kind of large and small, on any projects, you know, from kind of one-off pieces of work to kind of multi-year, kind of transformational-led projects with organisations. So that's kind of been my focus for the last couple of years, and it's great to be part of this session today. Just quickly, I guess for anyone who's kind of unfamiliar with the work of Julie's Bicycle, we are a charity that's been around for over 10 years now, and we work with the creative community to take action on climate change and sustainability. We started originally in the music industry, but we now work across all the arts and culture sectors, so from theatres, museums, visual arts, touring, festivals, everything that kind of falls under that broad banner. In terms of our work as JB, so as I mentioned, we kind of sit somewhere between the intersection between the arts and the creative industries and sustainability. So we kind of, our team is made up of kind of professionals from each of those kind of areas. And like I said, our work fits somewhere in the middle here. So here's just a few examples of the types of things that we do in that space. So I mentioned sort of one-to-one consultancy work we do with organizations in the sector. We also do training. We produce resources, tools. We do work at the policy level, both city and internationally. And we do a lot of independent research and advocacy as well. So there's kind of a lot going on within the, I guess, the melting pot of people and professionals working at JB. But we're always straddling that line between the arts and sustainability in terms of our focus. And today's session is really talking about, broadly speaking, about organizational action and taking action on sustainability, which is kind of what we promote at JB. And this is something that whether you're a large organization, small organization, whether you're just starting out, whether you've already put measures in place, it's something that, can be, intimidating, can be kind of overwhelming, but hopefully this will be an interesting session just to think about some of the key areas or key principles to focus on when thinking about taking action as an organization. And I've kind of structured this really around the key principles we've outlined in the Season for Change toolkit, which hopefully some of you have seen. And that's really looking at these key 4 areas. So first is the commitment of an organization. So that's really thinking about organizational governance and things like environmental policies and action plans. There's also looking at understanding. So building an understanding of your environmental impacts, understanding, what you do, what opportunities you have and what challenges you might need to overcome. Then there's also looking at constantly improving. So improvement is a big aspect. Obviously, year to year, you want to be making, improvements as an organization, making yourself more sustainable and taking on greater work. And then finally, communication is a big one. So obviously, as I said, people might be at different stages of this kind of journey with sustainability, but it's often a tricky thing to talk about what you do as an organization. And it can often be quite an intimidating process in terms of speaking about green initiatives or kind of putting your head up above the parapet, as it were, around these issues. So I'm just going to talk about a few bits and tips around how you can approach that as well. And just a couple of questions I just thought I'd flag now, of things really kind of just to sort of think about during the session and perhaps take some notes on as well, if it's helpful. And these are just 4 things that I wanted to flag. So the first of which is, any key actions or things that you're already doing as an organization that perhaps you're quite proud of. What are any key actions or things that you'd like to focus on in the future? Who needs to be involved with them, and what support do you need to get those things off the ground? And they're just a few kind of things that hopefully they'll kind of come up throughout the session, but also we might return to at the end if people want to share any of their experiences of this, but it's just a few things to think about. And again, to maybe take away is, thinking, okay, what do we do really well, but also what do we want to do and what's kind of stopping us from doing that? Just as a few kind of things to think about. So the first kind of principle that I want to talk about with sustainability is really looking at kind of environmental governance. So the ability sort of to create and maintain clear policies, strategies and responsibilities within your organization, which is really a key starting point when you're doing this kind of work. So this may be, might be obvious to some of you, but starting with really environmental policies and action plans, the key difference here really is that an environmental policy should be really a statement of your commitment on sustainability, setting your arching ambitions, some key objectives, and that should always be accompanied by an action plan, which really kind of delves more into the detail of how are you going to achieve the objectives, who's responsible, what individual actions are there. And really these 2 things should be quite aligned, but they really serve different purposes. And obviously a policy will be much more tend to be publicly focused, whereas an action plan is something that you can work on internally. So why even have a policy in the first place? I mean, there are various reasons, a few of which are just listed here. I mean, for one, as I've already mentioned, it's on one side of it, it's a public statement and commitment of what you're doing as an organization. There's an ability to kind of unify around the direction that a policy is suggesting, because often what happens with organizations, particularly those starting out, is that there might be a lot of siloed work taking place where a couple of individuals are really driving things forward. There's changes in certain departments, but it's not kind of joined up, and there isn't a kind of unified kind of voice as an organization as to what you're trying to achieve. And that's really something that's a good policy anyway will kind of join those dots of what everyone is doing within an organization. And also kind of beyond that, they, can be an effective tool for engagement. So whether that's, for your staff, for audiences, for suppliers you work with, they can be helpful for things like funding applications, working with collaborators, and it's really, the use of them kind of goes a lot, much further beyond, I guess, just the basic, things of stating what you like to do, and it's something that is certainly worthwhile. So this is just a few quick sort of facts that have come out of our latest work we do with the Arts Council England. So we write a report every year for the national portfolio organisations who have to take some environmental reporting. And just the key one I wanted to flag here is really the things around that are kind of linked to these policy things about why do this kind of work. And actually, more than sort of 2/3 have of that group have reported that, having a policy is useful for things like funding applications. People have seen improvements in things like morale and reputation as an organization. And it's something that people, audiences are much more in tune with and much more up to date with and expecting more of organizations at the moment. So it's something that, people need to be kind of aware of, and people need to be thinking about how they're portraying, what they do as an organization, certainly. So in terms of just a couple of key principles of what makes a good policy, I've mentioned some already. Really, the key thing is they need to be specific to the nature of your organization and the kind of activities and impacts that you do. So, there's no point there are benefits of following certain structures, but there's no one size fits all in terms of a good policy. It needs to align with what you do as an organization, and it really should align with other organization policies you have in place, whether it's business plans, whether it's other strategic documentation, but it really wants to have the kind of the look and feel and kind of voice of your organization. And it shouldn't be something that's, kind of separated, that doesn't really match with the rest of the things you do as an organization, because that's often the way it ends up getting siloed and kind of perhaps neglected compared to some other kind of priorities. And a key one actually within that is, to build really the support of senior leadership and kind of director and top management for that policy. And like I said, having that alignment with other strategic goals and documentation of an organization is kind of a good way to approach that, because really you need the buy-in from senior leadership to kind of get things moving often with a good policy. And it helps to have developed that with the team and with as many representatives of the organization to make sure that it really is, meeting the needs of that organization. So again, just kind of to summarize a bit of those points there, just a couple of do's and don'ts. Again, make that policy specific to your organization, be clear about your intentions, say why it is you're doing this, why this matters to you as an organization. Try and get senior management support, and always try and consult with your team and other stakeholders, so audiences as well, about what goes into that policy. And kind of on the flip side, I think a key one is the kind of the flip side between, I guess, talking too vaguely and being too kind of broad in general, but also going the other way and being kind of over ambitious, making kind of wild statements about, things that either, don't really, aren't relevant to the organization, or, you're not in a position to kind of follow up on and kind of explain in more detail. And I think there can be a tendency to kind of cover too much almost, because, sometimes organizations, if you cover a wide range of activities, it can be a bit daunting, and, you do a lot of work, there's a lot of people involved and a lot of impacts. And I think the key is to kind of, again, to really focus on making it as specific as possible, but also just relevant to what you do, and not kind of, and not kind of making it so kind of unwieldy that it doesn't really mean anything, because it's either, too vague or too kind of wildly and ambitious in the statements. Not that there's wrong with having kind of goals and targets, but just it's something to kind of try to get the kind of focus on. And like I said, a good policy should always be accompanied by an action plan. This is just an example of, of what one might look like. Again, these tend to be internal documents, and it's really just, this is where the action would happen for an organization, or certainly how you'd keep track of it. And it might be that an environmental action plan is reviewed by, it might be, an individual who's working on it. It might be the green team, if you have one in place, who are working through these things. And it's really taking those objectives and those goals from the policy and breaking them down into a kind of, actionable tasks that you can work through. And again, in terms of how these look, there's no kind of perfect formula for it, but I think key things to really think about and to include within these are obviously, an indication of the objectives you're trying to meet, the actions, who's responsible, certainly, timeline, and usually an indicator of, how you've made that. Because I think while policies can have kind of broader objectives and goals stated, I think what makes a good action plan is that you've got a kind of measurable way of tracking that progress to say, yes, we have done this, we've got, X, Y, Z pieces of evidence or actions have been made, just so you can really check in your progress as a team to say, yes, we are, we're making progress on these objectives and we need to, prioritize other ones as well. So I think specificity is the key of an action plan. And the second principle that I was just going to mention was really looking at understanding. So this is really understanding your environmental impacts on an organization and really being accountable for what you do. Because that really goes hand in hand with developing a policy, is that you need to have a good understanding of where you're starting from, of what your kind of reach is and what your impact is, to really talk confidently about what you're doing as an organization. So in terms of kind of starting with that process, really you need to have done a good kind of scope or kind of audit of your organization and what you do. So what organization are you? Where are you based? What type of work do you do? Is it, events, exhibitions, performances? Do you own venues? Are you based in an office? Thinking about what type of audiences you work with, what type of impacts that you're looking at. So, do you travel a lot as an organization? You might be, you might run events or festivals. You might be a touring organization where that's the kind of, travel is the primary thing that you're doing. And also what kind of goods and services and materials are you using the most? And I think it tends to help to focus on the biggest things first, and then moving into the smaller areas to think, okay, what's the big buckets of things that we do that we really need to get a handle on? And once you've kind of done that exercise, what's helpful is to decide, why sustainability is important to your organization. And the reason that this is because, again, this kind of sort of comes back to the policy side of things of, the reasons for taking action ultimately can lead you down a different way in terms of certainly what your objectives are, but kind of the approaches that you take. So for instance, here's a few examples of different things that reasons that you might want to get involved in sustainability. So it could be business resilience, it could be, saving costs, it could be reputational, it could be just because, it's the quote unquote right thing to do and there are passionate people within the organization. Or it could be a funding requirement. So like I said, lots of the Arts Council funded organizations have to do this as a requirement in terms of thinking about sustainability. And I think it's important to think about what it is that is driving the organization's action to get involved with this, because that can lead you down a different route. As I said, if your primary focus is things like saving money and saving costs, then that might lead you down a route of things like, more around things like energy management and energy efficiency to kind of save costs within your buildings, versus, if your other motivation is things like engaging with audiences, and more kind of externally focused, then it might be that you're thinking about kind of programming or how you communicate and how you engage with your audiences, which might lead you down a second route of action. So I think that's a good thing to think about. You then obviously need to think about which activities to focus on. Like I said, it tends to help to start with your kind of biggest impacts. So if you're a venue-based organization, that will be your buildings. If you're, you run festivals, it might be thinking about your, the largest events that you run in a year, your flagship events. The same for things like tours, and to really kind of select a few key areas, at least as a starting point. It might be that people are further along, but certainly starting out, you want to start with those big buckets and think, okay, what it is that we do and what do we want to focus on? And once you've kind of got to that stage of thinking about, okay, maybe we're, wanting to focus on a particular event, a particular, particular building, it's helpful to kind of have a think about what environmental data or records you might already have in place, or what might you need to collect in order to build that understanding. So again, if you're looking at buildings, it might be things like thinking about your use of energy, water, waste, and thinking about, do we have records for those? Do we have a system for collecting that? If not, who do we need to speak to? Who's responsible for that? And who needs to pull that information together? The same for things like travel, so business travel. So most organizations have some way, process of obviously tracking the travel that they're either purchasing or making, but it might be that there is, that information isn't being logged, or it isn't being pulled together, and it's kind of, quite disparate across an organization, and there might warrant some interest in, okay, who's responsible to kind of pulling that together and getting a real feel of, okay, how much travel do we do and what is the impact of that? And then obviously things around purchasing decisions. So procurement is a very big impact across, across any type of organization. And again, it helps to think about what are the biggest things that you're procuring as an organization. Buildings, it's obviously things like, energy contracts, but also, things that you might sell in the building. If you've got restaurants, food establishments, things like that, there's lots of things to think about. And I think to get a good feel of, okay, what do we have in terms of data and information, and what do we need to collect? And again, and then kind of once you got to that stage, it's really prioritizing, thinking about, okay, having a look at all those things, what is the most important impact, and also thinking about what is the thing that you have the most control over. I think is a really key one to think about, because things like travel and transport are, they're a big impact, particularly things like audience travel and areas such as that. But it's also one of the harder ones to control or to influence to a certain degree. Obviously, if you're booking your own travel, that's different. And so it helps to think about, okay, what do we have the best control over, and what decisions can we make, and what is something that, is going to take a bit more time to come up with a plan around. So again, with kind of building-based organizations, really the priority should be thinking about that building, thinking about things like the energy, water, and waste that you use, the productions that are being run, the procurement, and things like kind of audience travel. They're more indirect as an impact, and you can still engage with that topic and think about ways to improve it. But it's recognizing, okay, where do we have the greatest influence, and where's the best use of your time? Because obviously, often it's teams working, with, it's just a couple of small individuals usually driving it within an organization, perhaps a green team, but people tend to be doing it on top of the work, the roles they already do, and people's time is often stretched, particularly now. So I think, having that prioritization and justifying why it is that you're choosing to focus on those areas is a big one. Yeah, and then again, once you've kind of gone through that stage, it's thinking about the kind of wider context and I guess ramifications of those decisions. So, after going through a process like that and doing that kind of scoping, you really need to think about, okay, so if this is what we want to do, who's going to be leading on it? What approval do we need? Is there any budget that who needs to be spoken to around that? And also how is it going to be kind of monitored and reviewed, and what kind of checks are there going to be to get that process moving? And again, these are things that ultimately will feed back hopefully into your kind of policies and action plans. But it's a process of, building who has the responsibilities really, and where is that work kind of split? Because again, it tends to be better felt within an organization if it's kind of spread amongst, a wider group in terms of it. But obviously, it tends to be that there's a smaller group who is driving it within an organization, and really to try and encourage, the buy-in of the full team and certainly senior leadership to help those people, delegate responsibilities and really make it something that's felt throughout the organization, and not just kind of a siloed piece of work that's taking place. And just to say, sometimes in this kind of, I guess, this scoping process that I've kind of talked about here, sometimes it does help to look a little deeper and perhaps, to get kind of expert help or support from other organizations in terms of building these things. So again, it might be that if you're running a series of venues, there's benefits in doing things like energy audits or reviews. There are various tools online for things like energy management. And I think it's sometimes helpful to get that additional support to get, either it's recommendations or it's just to have an independent review really of where you're at to kind of get those things moving, because while, pulling all that information together might be kind of straightforward, it's kind of what do you do next with it? Once you've done all that, where to focus. And sometimes it's helpful to get.
Hi, Will. We all seem to have lost your sound.
Hello?
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, sorry.
We lost it from the start of this slide.
Oh, okay. That's not a problem. I'll just repeat myself there. Apologies for that.
Someone saying that time was helpful to get.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say, following on from that previous slide, something that we do with a lot of our consultancy clients as Julie's Bicycle is we encourage people to engage with their staff and often do things like a staff survey. So really, I guess, two factors, but to think about getting, the staff's opinion on what they do as individuals, what they think of the organization and the work that they're doing, but also to get a gauge on, okay, what things do they want the organization to focus on, or what do they see as the priorities? Because particularly in larger organizations or organizations that, have big departments or work with a lot of, it might be a lot of freelancers or contractors, it might be that, people have very different priorities, and often, I guess, the benefit disadvantage of things like a green team is that, if you've got a couple of people driving it, they might come up with a great strategy, but it's the wider staff have got a different view of what the priority is. And it's something that we found really useful. A couple of examples there, we did these kind of surveys with the V&A Museum and Curzon Cinemas, and it was really helpful just to build an understanding of, okay, what do the staff see as the priority, and then to feed that back into the development of things like a policy and an action plan. And again, to make it feel kind of felt throughout the organization, rather than just a couple of people, have come up with the whole plan and it's kind of being diluted down, I think. So I think that's something that's worth thinking about. So the kind of third principle I wanted to mention is how to kind of communicate and engage with your stakeholders on climate action. So again, if you've done the work to kind of scope and build an understanding of your organization, and you've developed a policy, you've developed a strategy, it's kind of how do you then go and talk about it and how to kind of approach that. And I'm sure, this is kind of common to many of you, but obviously the importance of, communicating effectively is, a collection of different things, whether it's inspiring action, spreading the word, creating dialogue, celebrating successes. There's really no remit to the benefits of communications. But I think something that is people often struggle with in terms of, communicating sustainability and issues of climate change is that it's really hard basically to talk about it. And there's a wide variety of reasons why that is. There's a few of them just listed here. But kind of some of those ones there, I'm sure are kind of familiar to many of you. It's something it's a very big topic. It's on a huge level, really, when you think about it at its most extreme. It's something that's uncertain, it's complex, it can often seem distant and far away, particularly from, smaller organizations or organizations have very different priorities. And I think it's easy to think or kind of maybe downplay what you could do as a smaller organization, or just an organization in general, in terms of the wider, scope of everything going on with it. So I think it's a good thing with it is just appreciating that it is difficult communicating climate change, and it's something that does warrant, you know, taking a bit of time to think about how you do that. And again, I think one thing which is helpful to do is to think a bit about, again, you know, purpose and who you want to be speaking to in terms of, you know, even beginning to think about, you know, communicating your work. So, you know, it might be, here's just a few examples here, that, you know, there's different things that you can talk about with sustainability as an organization. You know, it might be that you're talking about very practical things. It might be you're talking about, you know, programming, events you're doing. It might be awards or big projects that you're involved with. And it's just kind of thinking about, okay, who is most interested in what, and who is it that we're actually trying to speak to. So again, it might be that things like, you know, the core stuff you work with, and audiences and artists might, you know, are likely to be very interested in very practical things. Okay, so, you know, what do we do as an organization? What can we do to help? As opposed to, you know, the kind of wider things around, I don't know, things around, you know, policies at the national level or environmental science and things like that. They probably want to focus on, okay, what can we do? Whereas, you know, if you think about other people, things like, you know, press or in, you know, other areas tend to quite like things like, you know, awards and certifications and big projects and things like that. And they want to shout about these things, which is great. But I think it's just worth thinking about what is it that you're trying to communicate and who is it that you want to reach, because there are different levels of what you talk about, obviously, when speaking about climate change. So I think you want to always try to be quite focused in what you're saying. So again, just a kind of sort of summary of a few of those points. What you want to do is obviously, you know, tell stories that speak to the interests of the people that you're speaking to. So whether that's, you know, internal, external, you know, stakeholders, or, you know, partners, whoever it might be. And I think a key one here is really to be kind of relevant and to be kind of transparent with what you're saying. And something that's really important with that, I think, is to not assume that people, you know, know what you're talking about and just kind of instantly get it when you say things around, you know, reducing emissions or reducing, you know, plastics and things like that. I think that can be a key one to think about, is, you know, you being more kind of descriptive and explaining what it is that you do can be helpful to people to understand, you know, why should they care about that issue? Why should they be impressed by the work that you're doing? Because often, and particularly with, you know, certain impact areas, people tend to get quite fixated on certain areas. You know, it might be something like plastics, which is a very visible impact, something that people, you know, get quite passionate about, and, you know, rightly so, it's an important environmental impact. But then compared to some areas, you know, it might be even things like energy use of a building. It's harder to communicate to, you know, an audience as to why that's important, or why, you know, priorities might be put there over something else that, you know, that people can see. You know, if they walk into a venue and they see, you know, a plastic cup or something like that, people can, you know, react quite strongly to it. And I think it's just being kind of clear with what you're kind of talking about there. And then kind of on the flip side, I mentioned a few of those there, is also to not kind of, again, coming back a bit to the policies, to not talk too vaguely, and just sort of, you know, go down the line of saying we're super sustainable, or we're super green, and we're or certainly making it sound like you've achieved the end goal. Because I think the key point is that all organizations are on a journey in terms of this sustainability work, and you might have done a lot of great work already, but there's always work to be done, and I think it never stops, really. So I think that's a key one, is when communicating, you don't want to make it sound like, you know, we've done everything and we're all set to go. It's a process of finding out, you know, how to get better and how to improve, and I think that's a key one to think about. Obviously, with all comms stuff, you need to think about the channels of engagement. So whether that's internal, external. So it might be that you're doing things on social media, on your websites. It might be, if you're engaging with audiences, it could be things like ticketing, booking, emails. It might be events that you're running, you know, programs. It might be that you want to include something in a program for, an event that has a sustainability theme, or you might have, got a new initiative that you want to communicate to people or get audiences involved in. So it's thinking about how to do that. But also, I guess a key thing is certainly internally with your staff and the people who work there, is, to have kind of clear comms around what their roles are, what the expectations are for them as people who work in those buildings or work at those events, and what is the, what's the culture of that event or organization, and what's expected of people who either work there or attend those events, and thinking about how to kind of talk about that. And again, just a kind of quick sort of example really is to think about how you're talking about messaging, and certainly, coming off the back of what we were just talking about with data and things like that, is to kind of contextualize what you're saying, and to make it more interesting, but to put it in context really as to what you're saying. Because, while people saying something like, we've reduced energy consumption by X%, or we've reduced emissions by, by so many percentage or so many tons of carbon, can sound impressive, but also very abstract and very, people don't know quite what that means. Is that good? Is that bad? It's hard to know really without a comparison. So it's thinking about how to kind of reframe things with a bit of context. So again, just the example at the bottom, if you're talking about things like emissions, it's maybe putting it in the context of either a wider target you might have as an organization, or in line with, either something that's happened at the city level or maybe nationally, something that has there's a bit of context to, okay, we're doing this work, and this is what we're, either aligning with, or this is what we're aiming towards, just to give it a bit of context, and it not just be a kind of throwaway number of, oh, we've kind of, made this reduction of X amount. And just a couple of pointers on that. I think it always helps to think about the kind of so what of your statement. If you're saying, we've done this, we've done that, it's like, what's the, what does it mean? What does that mean? Again, coming back to that previous point, if you're making these statements about what you're doing, it's why should people be excited or impressed, and kind of thinking, okay, what is it that you want them to take away from what you're saying? And again, to not assume that people will just kind of understand it, because particularly things around carbon and even certain impacts, even, things around, you might be talking about the impacts of food, and, to some people it's very apparent what the impacts of food and food waste and things are, and, the environmental impact of that. But to others, it's probably less clear. And sometimes those things need to, you need a bit of context around it. Otherwise, people don't see the value, either in perhaps what you're doing, or you might not get as much engagement from it. And again, just a couple of things on the kind of the sort of greenwash idea. Again, these are just a few terms that it's not, it's not, to say don't entirely never use any of these phrases again. And I wouldn't panic if any of them have, found their way into any policies or anything that you've used. But I think it's always to not default to phrases like that, and without having, again, the context of what you're saying, and explaining a bit more in detail about what you do. Because again, I think particularly audiences these days are very, they're very hot on a lot of these issues, and they understand a lot more, and I think, and that's great, because they can, organizations and audiences can kind of challenge each other's and work together on that. But I think it's just to be aware that it can catch people out a bit, is that it's just to go for those kind of blanket statements or very blunt statements of, we're just, we're eco green, planet friendly, whatever it might be. So it's just one thing to think about. And actually, just an example following that line, actually, on the kind of food front, Shambhala Festival is a festival in the UK who've done a lot of great work really across all areas of work that they do. But something they do really well is kind of talk about the initiatives and the work that they do with audiences, and certainly on things like their website and in their kind of comms materials. So just an example, a couple of years ago, they switched the festival to being entirely meat and fish free across the whole event, which they've maintained actually for the following couple of years, which is great. And kind of what's interesting about that is that they, in the process of going about that campaign, they They did a lot of engagement with audiences. They surveyed them beforehand. They ran a kind of trial of it. They did a follow-up survey. They really kind of spoke with the audiences a lot about, talking to them about how they feel about this, but also explaining why they were interested in doing it and what it meant to them as the festival, as the organization, and why they wanted audiences to kind of engage and kind of collaborate with them on this kind of idea. And this is just an example from the website, and they've got this for a lot of the initiatives they run actually, but they're quite good at just explaining, okay, again, what's the change we're doing, what's the initiative, why are they doing it, what's their interest, and providing just, again, the context and reasoning behind the decision making they're making as an organization and how they kind of prioritize. Because again, as we talked about before with the policies, you end up always having to prioritize something in terms of what you're doing, because whether it's limited resources or anything like that. But it's just being it's a kind of explaining that justification and kind of engaging with audiences and not assuming that they will just understand if what Shambhala didn't want to do was just to say, okay, we're just completely switching to meat and fish free, and that's it, and kind of have no kind of information around that or no opportunity for people to discuss it. And I think they've had a really positive reaction from their audiences off the back of that approach, I think. And kind of the final one I just wanted to mention was really thinking about reducing your organization's environmental impact. So again, this is, I say, self-explanatory, but obviously not easy. But really, obviously, once you've got you've got your policy, you've got your understanding, maybe you've kind of thought about communications, is really you want to be improving year to year, and you want to be reducing your impact and making improvements. And obviously, the key to that, to some level, is having certainly an understanding in place in terms of what it is that you're trying to improve and be able to kind of communicate that story. I mean, it all kind of interlinks. It's, if you've got targets or objectives, you want to be able to say, we've done X amount. We've switched to green suppliers. We've switched to renewable energy. We've done X, Y, and Z, and to have ways to kind of communicate the improvement that you're making. And that's one thing to think about. Something that we do as Julie's Bicycle is part of our consultancy work. We do a certification program called Creative Green, which is kind of assessment of your organization. So whether it's a festival, event, tour, building, and it's kind of an assessment of where you are at the moment, with a kind of, looking at a year-to-year comparison of your organization and what you've done, and kind of outlining things to go forward. And again, it's the idea of that is a kind of framework for change and to almost set a kind of pathway, a roadmap of where you might go in the next few years, because I think it can be daunting kind of thinking about how to go ahead and make changes, but it's something that it's worth thinking about. And again, it kind of comes back to how you frame your policy and your action plan in terms of what you're trying to do, in terms of where you end up getting to. And there's just a couple of examples here, just from different organizations, again, who have done a bit of work. So Live Nation, who's an organization who run a lot of venues and live music events. They've done a lot of work recently around things around setting targets and setting some kind of goals, some of them kind of numerical, things like reduction targets and emissions, but also just having things that they'd like to kind of make organizational practice across everything they do. So for instance, they own and operate a lot of venues and offices, and one of their goals is to try and switch over all of those venues to be using renewable energy, and also to report on each of those venues and to report data, but then they also have specific kind of, I guess, time bound and data related targets of reducing things like emissions against a particular baseline. The Horniman Museum, this is just another example, who have recently kind of been public with a few of their goals. And again, it's a combination of thinking about what's kind of tangible and what can you do. So something that they've done is they've actually kind of created a new role, which is a climate and ecological action coordinator, to kind of help support this work. They've also got plans around switching to green electricity. They've got plans around biodiversity, and also a lot of kind of engagement work with both staff and audiences. So less so on the kind of maybe hard kind of number route, but also still having a bit of a mix there in terms of things that they can tick off to say, okay, we are, these are the kind of areas we're working towards. A Royal Court Theatre. So this is a great example, certainly, of quite a comprehensive plan, actually, over what they want to do over the next several years. And this is all public, actually, so feel free to have a look at it. But again, this is about kind of the idea to become carbon net zero as a theatre. And this is just a few things that they've kind of included within their kind of plans to do that. So again, there's familiar things I mentioned already, things around switching energy to a renewable energy supplier. There's things like around food, reducing the use of meat on food menus. There's becoming zero waste to landfill. There's reducing flights. There's using things like electric taxis and thinking about how they travel. And there's lots of different things that they've kind of thought about. And again, it's really that process that we've talked about there of scoping out what you do as an organization and kind of coming up with a plan to say, okay, these are our priorities, these are our biggest impacts, and what can we do about them? And that's something that, like I said, it's something that's kind of quite familiar, I think, with organizations in terms of, at the moment, is a lot of people are talking about, particularly, the word net zero and targets and things have come up a lot. I think certainly in the last 18 months, which is great, which is showing a kind of level of ambition. But I think with any kind of target setting, again, it's having that, you really need to have that good understanding of where you're starting from, what's your kind of baseline, and what do you want to achieve. And again, even coming back to what we said before about things of explaining and providing context, is even things like net zero or zero emissions and things like that. It's wanting to put the context around it to explain, what does that mean for your particular organization, and to not assume that people know what that means, and to really think about that. And that's something that I know the Royal Court has done with their kind of plan, is to kind of break down what it is that they're talking about when they say net zero, and the things that they want to kind of try and achieve. So that was so that was most of the things I wanted to cover. Like I said, all of those things, those 4 principles that I've discussed there, are what's really outlined in the Season for Change toolkit. So some of you might have seen that already. There's a few case studies and examples on there, a few resources that you can have a look at, which kind of delve a bit deeper into some of those examples I've talked about. What I was going to maybe leave on here, because we've got a bit of time now for any questions that anyone might have, but I'd also just leave this on here because as something to maybe think about as a kind of last point, is again this thing around, what key actions are you already doing as an organization? What do you want to focus on in the future? Who needs to be involved, and what support do you need? And maybe even if it's just thinking about, okay, what's one thing or 2 things that we would really like to do, and what steps do we need to take to get involved? Maybe it's having a conversation with a certain person. Maybe it's maybe it's speaking to a certain partner or a certain supplier. It's kind of, they could be small or large in terms of what those actions are. But I think something to take away is just to think of, maybe think of, again, the things you've already done, and to kind of celebrate those things, and think about, okay, what steps have we taken, but also what can we do? And I think that would be a good thing to think about. But we do have a bit of time now for any questions anyone has, and either kind of questions about any of the things we've talked about there, or if anyone has anything they'd like to share about, perhaps those questions at the end there, that would be great as well. But any questions would be lovely.
I've got a question from the comments, which was, how does JB define net zero? I'll read out some of the other ones as well in a second.
How does JB define net zero? So we don't have a, I guess we don't have an organization focused definition of it. I mean, net zero, it really comes back to, yeah, the word has been mentioned a lot. I guess the key is scoping out what are your impacts, because I guess the key thing is thinking about, there's something called scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, which is kind of the greenhouse gas reporting protocol. And it's just a way of breaking down different impacts and emissions as your organization. So scope 1 emissions would be talking about things like the fuel that you use, so any fuel that's kind of burnt as an organization. Scope 2 is looking at more indirect energy impacts, so things like the use of electricity. And scope 3 emissions is really everything else that you do as an organization. So, it could be travel, could be procurement, could be really everything that doesn't fall out that remit of of kind of fuel and electricity. And I think that's the bit that's kind of challenging when thinking about net zero, because obviously, when people talk about a net zero venue, it's interesting because it's, in terms of following kind of guidance, there's the idea of having, if you were using a 100% renewable supplier as a venue, if you were, zero waste to landfill, if you, reduced, using ethical suppliers and things like that, it's kind of, you reach a point, but there'll always be a kind of bucket of some, which will fall in that scope 3, which will still kind of exist. And I guess that's where something like carbon offsetting comes in, which is a whole nother kind of minefield of, of a topic really. But it's something where most kind of targets and things around net zero is the idea that you reduce your emissions as much as possible. And carbon offsetting is meant to be the absolute last resort. So the very, very last thing you do. So the things you really can't change or you can't remove entirely. So things like certain, if you're a, maybe a touring based organization, or things like audience travel, things like that, things that again are kind of indirect impacts which you can't eradicate completely. If you want to function as an organization, then there'll always be an element of needing to get involved in something like carbon offsetting, but it's always it should always be a last resort, as the things you really can't do, and the focus should be on trying to become a kind of zero emission or as low as possible to low emission venue or event, based on those kind of things you really can control. I'm thinking about that. But I guess the key with net zero is that you just have to really scope it yourself as an organization to say, this is kind of how we're classifying it. And like I said, we actually did a session on net zero and a few examples around how to, examples of organizations and different ways to approach it. I think it was a couple of months ago actually, and we've got a recording of that and the kind of case studies from that. So that's something that we could always share as well. Because like I said, there is different approaches, and we certainly there isn't a kind of silver bullet for how to approach that. There's a question on the kind of carbon calculator. So a question saying the carbon calculator that was kind of displayed at some point during the presentation was covering impacts such as transport, energy, waste, and does it cover other aspects of emissions? Yes. So I think the one that we're talking about was probably the Creative Green Tools, which is a free online platform that Julie's Bicycle runs, which is, a carbon calculator that's been designed for the arts and cultural sector. So again, whether you're an office, a venue, tour, event, and you can report on emissions and calculate your impacts for, anything from kind of energy, water, waste, business travel, audience travel, touring travel, some materials as well, productions, things like that. And that's kind of a great tool that we've kind of worked with. And it's actually the platform that the Arts Council MPO organizations have to report to. So every year they have to go through that process with us. And it will, they input their kind of basic information and they'll get a footprint kind of generated, broken down by those different emissions. So it's something that's hopefully helpful for people to have a look at.
I have one which came from Stephanie, which was, "Hi Will, can you recommend a program or website where non-experts can learn how to measure carbon measures within their building or organisation?" That was sent to me private.
Oh yeah, no, sorry, I'm just looking. Yeah, no, I'm just looking at it. Learn how to measure carbon measures in the building organisation. Program or website. I mean, there are a few. Yeah, I appreciate it. It can be a tricky thing. I think something that's helpful is, again, something like the Creative Green tools is useful because it's obviously, you know, an organization could go down the route of kind of calculating those things themselves. I think what exists in the Creative Green tools aren't the only site that's available for doing this, but basically a kind of platform where you're not doing the calculation yourself. The tool is, you know, producing the kind of carbon figure, but what you're kind of doing is collecting, I guess, the kind of raw information. So something like, you know, if it's a building, it's, you know, if you're talking about, and I've said it throughout this session, but like energy, water, waste, what I actually mean by that is basically the consumption figures. So, you know, how much energy, how much electricity and gas do you use? How much water do you use? You know, things that you get from kind of basic bills. And waste, kind of similarly, it's kind of how much, you know, waste gets collected from your building. And basically something like the tools or other kind of calculators, you kind of input that kind of basic information and it will give you a kind of footprint off the back of that and an indication as to what that impact is. And I think we've certainly, we've run different sessions actually, JB, with different resources of how to, you know, how to go about collecting data. So whether that's, you know, actually getting the data itself or using the tools. And maybe there's a couple of things we could share actually in the follow-up to this in terms of those resources, because whether that's, you know, again, events, buildings, whether it's, you know, really focused on something like energy, water, waste, we've got very specific guides and resources of how to collect those things, what questions to ask, and what information you need to go about that. So I think there's certainly a few things we could share off the back of this, which would be helpful. There was a question about the slides, and I think we're fine to share all the slides after the session. Is that right, Salome? I think, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, we'll send around an email to all attendees with a follow-up with links to the slides and everything.
There's a question about any examples from work done by smaller organizations. Because yeah, to be fair, I think most of the examples in there tend to be larger ones. I mean, I think certainly on via JB and Season for Change as well, actually, we've got a combination of kind of case studies that we've kind of pulled together over the years. And we've got, I think, dedicated pages certainly on the JB website. And there's some case studies, obviously more focused on the kind of programming side with Season for Change as well. So there's certainly lots of things to have a look at in terms of smaller organizations who, you know, are working on a much different scale to perhaps some of the organizations we've discussed today. So I think that's the only questions that come through at the moment. I don't know, Salome, if you want to say anything else on this week, or?
Yeah, I was just going to thank everybody for attending. Obviously thank Will and the rest of the Season for Change team and Jean for providing the live subtitles. As Will just alluded to, this is not, this is sort of nearly the middle point of the exchange, and something that if you've been following our launch, we are actually doing another event, an extra event this week. So following on from the keynote speech tackling climate change and building an inclusive movement that we did with the poet Zena Edwards last week. We've actually got a new Q&A event with her on Thursday, this Thursday, the 5th of November at 3 p.m. And Octagon will be dropping the link in. I think all that remains for me to say is that we will be emailing you with some of the slides and details. And yeah, please do keep in touch. Thank you.